The first pickup truck stopped because of a little girl standing beside a dusty country road. She couldn't have been older than 11. She wore faded blue overalls, old brown boots that looked 2 sizes too big, and a straw hat that kept slipping over her eyes every time the wind picked up. In one hand, she held a small notebook with neatly written measurements. In the other, she pointed toward a pile of rusty irrigation pipes lying beside an empty field. Every truck that passed that morning heard the same quiet question. "Are you throwing those away?" Some drivers smiled, some looked confused, a few laughed before answering. "Take all you want, sweetheart. They're no good anymore." She thanked every single one of them. Then she dragged another heavy pipe toward an old wagon waiting under a cottonwood tree. By lunchtime, the wagon was overflowing with dented aluminum pipes, cracked fittings, rusty elbows, and bent connectors that nobody else wanted. People driving through the tiny farming town of Maple Creek slowed down just long enough to shake their heads. What could a child possibly do with all that junk? The answer would take an entire growing season, and before summer was over, many of the same people who laughed would find themselves standing silently at the edge of her family's field, wondering how they had missed something hiding in plain sight. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, all anyone could see was a little girl collecting trash. Maple Creek rested between long stretches of wheat fields and gentle hills that turned golden every July. One narrow road connected the town to the outside world. It passed an old grain elevator, a weathered feed store, a small church with peeling white paint, and a diner where farmers gathered every morning before sunrise. Life here moved with the seasons instead of the clock. In spring, tractors filled the roads before daylight. In summer, the air carried the smell of fresh cut, hay and warm soil. Autumn painted the trees, along Miller Creek in deep shades of orange and red. Winter covered everything with a quiet blanket that made the whole valley seem to pause. Most families had known each other for generations. People noticed when someone painted a barn. They noticed when a new calf was born. And they definitely noticed when an 11-year-old girl spent every Saturday hauling home broken irrigation pipes. Her name was Emma Carter. She lived with her father, Ben, her grandmother, Ruth, and her younger brother, Caleb, on a small family farm just outside town. The farm wasn't large, 40 acres, one aging tractor, a weathered red barn that leaned slightly toward the west after decades of prairie winds. Their farmhouse creaked every winter, and the porch steps always squeaked no matter how many times Ben tightened the screws. Money was always carefully counted. Nothing useful was ever thrown away. Even so, Ben couldn't understand what his daughter was doing. Every morning before school, Emma followed the same routine. She scattered feed for the chickens before the sun reached the fence line. She checked the vegetable garden. Behind the house, she filled fresh water for the family's old sheepdog, Scout, who waited patiently beside the porch every day. Only after finishing those chores did she hurry inside, where oatmeal steamed on the kitchen table. Grandma Ruth always noticed the dirt under Emma's fingernails. "You've already been digging." Again, Emma smiled without looking up. "A little." Ben folded his newspaper. "What are you working on now?" Emma shrugged. "Just something I've been thinking about." That answer had become almost routine. She was always thinking about something. Sometimes she built tiny windmills from scrap wood. Sometimes she rearranged stones along the creek to watch how water changed direction. Once she spent 2 weeks studying where rain collected after every storm. Most children her age rode bikes through town. Emma carried measuring tape, the idea that puzzled. Everyone had started months earlier. It began during one of the driest summers Maple Creek had seen in years. The family garden struggled. Despite careful watering, leaves curled under the afternoon sun. Tomato plants stopped growing. Even weeds seemed tired. Ben spent long evenings moving heavy sprinklers across the field, hoping every drop counted. Still, too much water disappeared before reaching the roots. Emma noticed something no one mentioned. Every evening, after the sprinklers stopped, the ground looked wet. But when she pushed her finger a few inches below the surface, the soil felt almost dry. She checked again the next day, and the next. Then she began carrying a notebook everywhere. She wrote dates, temperatures, cloud, cover, How long each row stayed damp, no one asked. Why no one imagined an 11-year-old was quietly collecting clues. One Saturday morning, Emma rode with her father to Harper Equipment, the only farm supply yard within 30 miles. Broken machinery lined one fence. Old pipe sections lay stacked behind a rusted shed, waiting to be hauled away for scrap. While Ben searched for a used tractor belt, Emma wandered toward the pile. She picked up one pipe, then another. She crouched beside them, measuring their length with a tape she had tucked into her pocket. The owner, Mr. Harper, chuckled. "You planning to build yourself a spaceship?" Emma looked up politely. "No, sir." "Then what are you making?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure it'll work yet." That answer made him laugh even harder. "Well, if it doesn't, you'll have enough metal to build a fence." He waved his hand. "Take whatever you want." Emma thanked him and loaded 3 long pipes onto the trailer. Ben watched quietly. On the drive home, curiosity finally got the better of him. "Emma, what exactly are you trying to build?" She looked out the truck window at miles of dry fields rolling past under the afternoon sun. "I think—" She stopped, then smiled. "I'll tell you after I test." Ben laughed softly. "You sound just like your grandfather." Emma had never met him. He had passed away before she was born. But Grandma, Ruth often said he believed every problem had an answer, hiding somewhere in the field. Emma wondered if that was true, because every evening, she returned to the same dry patch behind the barn, carrying another old pipe, and another question no one else seemed to be asking. And before anyone understood what she was building, something unexpected would make the entire town pay attention. The patch of ground behind the old red barn wasn't much to look at. It sat between a leaning fence and a row of aging cottonwood trees that whispered every time the evening wind crossed the valley. The grass there had long since given up. The soil had hardened into uneven cracks, and only a few stubborn weeds pushed through the dry earth. Most people walked past it without a second glance. Emma saw a place to test an idea. Every afternoon after school, she changed out of her backpack, slipped into the same dusty boots, and wheeled a rusty toolbox toward that forgotten corner of the farm. Scout, the old sheepdog, followed a few steps behind, settling into the shade as if he knew they would be there until sunset. She laid the old irrigation pipes across the ground one by one. Some were bent, some still carried faded blue paint. Others had tiny holes where years of use had finally worn them thin. She studied every piece before placing it. Aside, she wasn't looking for perfect pipes. She was looking for something else. But what? The first thing she did surprised even her father. Instead of connecting the pipes the way every farmer did, Emma took them apart. She unscrewed joints, removed broken valves, sorted every fitting into small wooden boxes she had labeled with neat handwriting. Long pieces in one pile, short sections in another, curved elbows in a third. It looked less like farming and more like someone solving a giant puzzle. One evening, Ben leaned against the fence and watched her for several minutes. "You know these don't fit together anymore." "I know. Most of them leak." "I know. So why keep the broken ones?" Emma picked up a small connector no bigger than her hand. "It isn't broken where I need it." Ben frowned. He almost asked another question. Instead, he smiled to himself and headed back toward the barn. Emma had earned enough trust over the years that he decided to let her continue. Still, he couldn't imagine what she was seeing. Across town, people had started talking, not in a cruel way, more in the way small towns always do. At Miller's diner, someone mentioned seeing Emma pulling another wagon full of scrap metal. Mrs. Dawson laughed into her coffee. "That little girl must be collecting enough pipe to water the whole county." An older rancher shook his head. "Kids come up with funny ideas." Another farmer smiled. "Better than staring at a phone all day." The table laughed, and the conversation moved on. But one man sitting quietly near the window didn't laugh. His name was Earl Jennings. He had farmed longer than most people in Maple Creek had been alive. His hands were rough, his back slightly bent, and he rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. He looked out the diner window for a long moment, Then quietly muttered, "Children notice things adults stop seeing." Nobody seemed to hear him. The next Saturday brought another trip. This time Emma rode her bicycle through town with a small wagon attached behind, and she stopped at nearly every farm, not asking for money, not asking for help, only one question: do you have any old irrigation pipes you're throwing away? Some families pointed toward junk piles behind their barns. Others invited her to look through storage sheds. A few apologized, because they had already hauled theirs to the scrapyard. Each time she found another piece, she carefully measured it before loading it onto the wagon. If it was too damaged, she left it behind. If it met her measurements, she smiled. By late afternoon, the wagon was almost too heavy to pull home. As she climbed the last hill toward the Carter farm, sweat dripped from beneath her straw hat. She stopped halfway, not because she was tired, because she noticed something. Rainwater from last week's storm still rested in a shallow ditch beside the road. Nearly 7 days had passed. The sun had been hot every afternoon. Yet beneath a layer of weeds, the soil was still damp. Emma knelt beside the ditch. She scooped up a handful of dirt. It felt cool. She smiled to herself, then wrote another note in her little notebook. Whatever she was looking for, she was getting closer. The following week became her first real test. She dug narrow trenches behind the barn, not deep, just enough to hide sections of old pipe beneath the surface. Every few feet she stopped to measure again, then adjusted the angle, then measured once more. The work took hours. By sunset, her gloves were covered in mud. Her shoulders ached. Blisters formed across both hands. Grandma Ruth stepped onto the porch, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "You've been out here since lunch." Emma wiped sweat from her forehead. "I almost have it." Grandma looked at the strange pattern running across the ground. It didn't resemble rows for planting. It didn't resemble irrigation. It looked almost random. "You've got your grandfather's patience." Emma smiled. "I hope that's enough." 3 days later, she planted her first seeds. Just one small row, nothing special. Beans. She watered them once, then waited. The first week passed. Nothing. The second week brought tiny green shoots. Emma checked them every morning before school, every afternoon after school, every evening before bed. Then something happened. The plants nearest one end of the row began turning yellow. She dug carefully around the roots. The soil felt too wet. Water wasn't spreading evenly. Her idea hadn't worked. Not yet. She sat quietly beside the garden as the evening sky turned orange. Scout rested his head against her boot. For several minutes she said nothing. Finally, Ben walked over carrying 2 shovels. "You quitting?" Emma looked at the struggling plants, then slowly shook her head. "No." "What are you going to do?" She picked up her notebook. "I wrote down where it went wrong." Ben smiled. "So tomorrow?" "I dig everything back up." The next morning, before the sun had fully climbed over the hills, the sound of metal scraping against dirt echoed behind the barn. Every pipe came back out, every trench was filled. Hours of work disappeared before breakfast. If someone had driven past, they would have wondered why an 11-year-old was destroying the very thing she had spent weeks building. Even Caleb watched from the porch in confusion. "I thought you finished." Emma brushed dirt from her knees. "I finished learning." Caleb blinked. "So now what?" Emma looked toward the pile of old pipes stacked neatly beside the fence. Somewhere in that pile, one small mistake was hiding, and until she found it, nothing in Maple Creek would ever grow the way she believed it could. The next morning, the Carter farm looked as if someone had undone weeks of work overnight. The neat rows Emma had dug were gone. The old pipes were stacked beside the fence once, again each one marked with small pieces of colored tape. Red, blue, yellow. Tiny notes covered nearly every section. A stranger might have thought she was preparing them for recycling. Emma knew she was preparing them for another chance. She spread her notebook across the porch table while the morning sun warmed the wood beneath her elbows. Every page held careful drawings, measurements, and little arrows showing where the water had slowed, where it had rushed too fast, and where the soil stayed wet long after it should have dried. One line was circled 3 times. Water is stopping here. She stared at it for a long moment. If the water stopped there, what made it stop? That afternoon, Emma walked farther than usual, past the last fence on their property, past the old windmill that hadn't turned in years. She followed Miller Creek until it narrowed into a quiet stream winding through tall grass and smooth stones. She wasn't looking at the water. She was watching where it traveled around fallen branches, under tangled roots, between clusters of rocks. The stream never moved in a straight line. It curved, slowed, spread out, then gathered itself again. Emma knelt beside the bank and dropped a single leaf into the current. She followed it with her eyes. The leaf paused behind a stone before slipping through a narrow gap and floating downstream again. She smiled. Nature wasn't wasting water. It was guiding it. Could the same thing happen underground? Back home, she began sketching again. This time, her drawings looked nothing like ordinary irrigation systems. The pipes no longer ran in straight lines. They curved gently. Some split into smaller sections before joining together again. Ben glanced over her shoulder after dinner. "I've never seen pipes laid out like that." Emma nodded. "I've never seen roots grow in straight lines either." Ben didn't answer. He looked at the drawing one more time before heading outside to finish evening chores. He still didn't understand, but something about the way she said it stayed with him. The second build took nearly 2 weeks. This time Emma worked more slowly. She measured every slope with a homemade level built from an old board, 2 nails, and a glass marble. If the marble rolled too quickly, she adjusted the trench. If it stopped too soon, she adjusted again. Sometimes she spent 20 minutes changing the height of one single pipe by less than an inch. Caleb watched from nearby. "Does that tiny piece really matter?" Emma brushed dirt from her hands. "It might matter the most." The first test looked promising. She poured 1 bucket of water into the system. Instead of rushing through all at once, it moved quietly beneath the soil. A few minutes later, she checked several spots along the row. The ground felt evenly damp. For the first time, she smiled before writing in her notebook. Closer. Not perfect. Closer. Hope didn't last long. 3 days later, a summer thunderstorm rolled across Maple Creek. Heavy rain pounded the fields through the night. Wind rattled the old barn doors. Lightning flashed beyond the hills. By morning, Emma hurried outside before anyone else. Her boots splashed through puddles as she reached the test garden. She stopped. Several trenches had collapsed. Mud filled parts of the pipe. One section had completely washed apart. Hours of careful work lay buried beneath soaked earth. Emma didn't cry. She simply stood there in silence, rain dripping from the brim of her hat. Scout nudged her hand gently. She reached down and scratched behind his ears. Then she picked up a shovel. Grandma Ruth watched from the kitchen window. Ben stood beside her with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. "She hasn't even eaten breakfast," Ruth whispered. Ben looked toward the field. Emma had already started digging. Again, "I could help." Ruth smiled softly. "You could." He looked back toward his daughter. "But I think she needs to prove something to herself first." By midweek, word had spread again. "She's rebuilding it. Didn't it already fail? I heard the rain washed everything away." At Harper Equipment, Mr. Harper chuckled as he loaded supplies into a customer's truck. "I told you she'd end up building a fence." The customer laughed. "I'll believe that project works when corn starts growing in gravel." Neither man noticed Earl Jennings quietly loading feed into the back of his pickup. He closed the tailgate and looked toward the Carter farm in the distance. Then he said something almost under his breath. The biggest harvests usually begin where everyone else quits. This time, Mr. Harper heard him. He smiled politely, but he didn't believe it. Late one evening, after another long day of digging, Emma sat alone beside the unfinished garden. The sky glowed deep orange as the sun disappeared behind the hills. Crickets filled the silence. The smell of fresh soil drifted through the warm air. She opened her notebook. Most of its pages were covered with corrections, arrows, crossed-out drawings, new ideas written over old ones. Someone else might have seen mistakes. Emma saw a map. She turned to a blank page. Instead of drawing pipes, she drew roots, long, thin, branching in every direction. Then she quietly whispered to herself, "Maybe I've been building for the water." She paused. What if I should build for the roots instead? The question lingered in the evening air. It was the first time she had said it out loud, and without realizing it, she had just taken the biggest step yet toward solving the mystery that had puzzled the entire town. Because from that moment on, Emma stopped asking how to move water. She started asking how plants found it. That single change would lead her to a discovery no one in Maple Creek expected. But first, she would have to risk the one thing her family could least afford: